White screen. The rising flame logo on top. Black text appearing in the middle as if being typed says, in April 2020, we launched a series of online events for persons with disabilities and their friends stuck at home and cut off from their communities of care and support to lift spirits, reduce anxiety, and have exciting discussions. In September 2020, we were back with Vellapanti 2.0. Masculinity and Disability with Abhishek, Anicca, and Manak Matiyani. 18th September 2020. Pictures of both speakers in the middle of the screen.
Hi everyone, good evening. We welcome all of you to Vellapanti 2.0. I'm Nidhi Goyal. I'm the founder and executive director of Rising Flame. We brought to you Vellapanti as a series of events in April, right? In India, end of March was when we all went into lockdown. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of fear. It still continues, but what was really very, very disturbing for people with disabilities, for our friends, for people who work with, who we interact with, was the isolation, was the lack of engagement, was the lack of discussion. And that's what got us to putting this space together, to have a conversation, to think about, continue reflecting, to think about where we are in this world, to think about how the world is around us, and how we reflect on our own bodies, on issues around consent, on our own mental health, physical health, and so on and so forth. We're back now. When we stopped in April, we received a lot of requests to come back as an interaction to continue some interesting discussions. So we're back in our anniversary month. Yes, Rising Flame is turning 3, and that's why we thought we'll reconnect with you through Vellapanti 2.0 to have this space again, to not just celebrate who we are, to celebrate the diversities, but to have those difficult conversations, to have the fun conversations, to reflect together, to deconstruct, to think about, to challenge, to question, and so on. We will be here with you and for you every alternate Friday. So we're not doing it weekly, it's once in a fortnight. And today is the first session, and I would like to welcome all of you. The session is on masculinity and disability, right? And we will dive into what are we screening, who's going to speak with us, and so on and so forth. We have an interesting set of speakers here. We have some interesting films that we would be screening for you. But before that, just a few housekeeping things. We are on Zoom, and most of you will be are muted, but just a request again, if you could mute yourselves. The second request is also, if you join from a device and your participant name says Moto G, iPhone Plus, Samsung, anything else, please rename your device. It'll also be really, really helpful if you rename yourself, if you've tried to keep any other pseudonym or nickname, etc., unless it's for security, in which case you could text one of our team members and I would identify them shortly. The last piece is, again, we'd like to share with you that here we have our sign language interpreter, Gaurav. Gaurav, if you want to wave at everyone. For those who need to focus on Gaurav, please, you could spotlight your own videos. We have two of our young team members, Niyar and Fiza, live captioning for us today. Their document, the Google Docs link, is in the chat box and will be intermittently pasted by our team members. So you could go in the chat box and find the link and follow it through live captioning. We're going to try to maintain a certain pace and not go really fast because our interpreters and captioners need to follow and deliver as well. So that's a request. And the last is the consent. We are, as we'd circulated in our email, on our WhatsApp, through all our communications on social media, that the session will be live streamed on Facebook as well. It's a public event. So please feel free to keep your videos off if you do not want to be seen, identified, and feel free to use the chat box or the Facebook chat for asking any questions. We'll be compiling questions from both these places. Thank you once again, and let's talk about masculinity and disability. So, Rising Flame is a feminist disability rights organization, and that's how we locate ourselves. We talk about disability, gender, diversity, inclusion, plus, right, and the whole spectrum. Our ultimate vision is to have together an inclusive space, a safe space, an integrated approach to living, to life, and to coexisting. We really want to create a space where diverse bodies and minds thrive with dignity and are allowed that safety to exist. So we thought we'll bring to you a session on masculinity and disability because as a society, particularly in India, for folks who are joining from all over the world, I mean, I could take global examples, but if you look at some of the discussions in the country, some of the discussions globally around masculinity, immediately there's an image, immediately there are lines, immediately there are behaviors that are prescribed. If you're a man, what should you do? What should you not do? How should you behave? What should you wear? How should you look? What is this perfect man? And what does that look like? Now, if we think about disability, does it intersect with this perfect man? And what about other intersections? How do men exist if there is only one image of masculinity? So, to bring everything between this perfect man and all the diversities around, to unpack a little bit of what this man, the Greek god, looks like in reality for men. We are here today with our Vellapanti 2.0 first session on masculinity and disability. Once again, for all those of you who have joined now, I'm Nidhi Goyal, founder and executive director of Rising Flame, welcoming you. With this, we will dive into two short videos from Miss Malini. And you'll see it's conducted as a vox pop. There are two male anchors who are going and exploring around cities, around spaces, or what masculinity means to a common man. How do they define it? What love, relationship, sexuality, etc., looks within this masculinity spectrum for the man on the street. Before we start streaming, I would introduce you to the team here. We have Anicca Iyer, who's our programs associate, who is supporting us with the live stream and will be also available probably on chat. Um, there is Srinidhi Raghavan, who's our co-lead programs, who will also be streaming the videos for us. And if there is any specific issue, any safety concerns, any other concerns that you have, you could send a private text to her. We have Niar and Fiza, who would be live captioning, who are also interns with Rising Flame. And there is Divya, who's doing an internship with us, who also conceptualized this piece on masculinity and disability.
Click on the links in the description box below to watch the two videos on Miss Malini's YouTube channel titled Indian Men Explain Masculinity and Indian Men Talk About Love, Sex and Relationships.
So two very interesting videos, at least for us, and we're hoping that you found them interesting too. And I think some very, very key questions that were raised here by the two hosts, right? And they went around, they say in the city of Mumbai, to ask these questions, and not just what real man is, but also what sex, relationship, and love look like for this real man. And I think to answer some of these questions, to also go beyond what are the roles of men and women and how they're perceived in society. Um, we also want to take the discussion between is there only a man and a woman, and what happens to people who have come from other identities. So we're here. We'd like to welcome Abhishek and Manak. Just quick introductions. Welcome both of you, and thank you so much for agreeing to be our speakers for this evening. We really are looking forward to the discussions, to have discussions with you. Um, Abhishek, Abhishek Anicca. Abhishek is a disability rights activist, a writer, a poet based in Delhi, and works on masculinity and disability at Ambedkar University. Manak Matiyani is, and forgive me, Manak, if I've mispronounced your last name. He's the executive director of YP Foundation, a queer and feminist rights activist with extensive experience on facilitating trainings around gender justice, youth leadership, and sexuality rights. Welcome, both of you. And this session is really, I'm going to move myself out of the main picture and invite both of you to have a conversation with each other to answer some of these questions on what is this real man? What happens to a man living with a disability? What about a man who may be gay, considering that we have heard in the videos how the term gay was used, how the term disabled wasn't even considered. So, really, on the spectrum of disability queerness, what does this real man, quote unquote, look like? What do love relationships and sex look like for him? We're really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And you pronounced my name perfectly, so thank you for that as well. I think, yeah, I've done, just to give a little bit of context, I come at this from having done a lot of work on masculinity and sort of training and other kind of work, direct engagement with young men and boys. And this whole question of what is masculinity is a really exciting one for all men, I feel. Everybody is wondering, and whenever you put up this question saying we are going to talk about what is masculinity, everybody gets interested in a college space and they all come to that discussion. And usually they come in and say, ki, aap bata do, just tell us what it is so that we can figure it out and do it well. And so what I've understood is that while there is no answer for like what is masculinity, or that there is no standard way, like, that's what all of these men also struggle with, that there is no one standard way of understanding masculinity. There is a standard perception about masculinity, which is, like they said, about power. And about being the powerful one. And I think in slightly more academic circles, they always say that masculinity is actually this sense of entitlement to power, not just power. तो आपको लगता है कि power होनी चाहिए, वो हो या ना हो, and so that's where what complicates it even more in this intersection, where as a queer man you have certain power, you're entitled, you feel entitled to a certain power, but you may not actually have it in different situations. And I'm very curious to hear from you also, Abhishek, on how that plays out, because there is very little that is done on disability and masculinity. So how does that sense of entitlement play out vis-a-vis actually not having power in many spaces in the context of disability?
Thanks, Manak. I think masculinity becomes a very interesting topic when it comes to disability, because the whole notion of what is a man, even if he's not the quote unquote ideal man, even if he's the normative man, disabled men and non-men and queer folks are disabled, I don't think they fit into the category of a man. And when we talk about masculinity, when we are generally talking about something called, in academic terms, something called hegemonic masculinity, which is what you said, basically the man who has power over society on the basis of him being a man, and who has power over other men, non-men, and women. So when we look at that, and of course, it's the whole thing is facilitated by patriarchy. But I think that conversation is something that we already have in academic discourse, not so much in public spaces, but in academic discourse we have that space. What we miss out on is a discourse on vulnerabilities, how vulnerable these disabled men or non-men can be in a society where there is a constant pressure of being defined as a man, who is a man. And with disabled people, their bodily experiences and their societal experiences shape who they are as men. During my research, what I found is definitely that there is no singular thing which defines masculinity, but there are multiple masculinities. For some people, it's sex which defines them, that helps them define themselves as men. For some people, it's communication. For some people, it's independence within a family or independence altogether. So people have different ideas of what essentially defines them as a man in the society. So that is an interesting point which we often come to. And as you said, ki, often we have wonder about ki, people, they think that they know about masculinity, and which is good. But what happens is when you get into a conversation with them, it is often very skewed in terms of uh, topics of toxic masculinity, for example, which was also brought in the video. A lot of things which we have been hearing from childhood, it's either about female bodies, it's about non-men awareness of someone being different, or it's about kitna sex kiya maine, how much sex I have had, or how many girlfriends I have. The whole culture of during an early age also we are taught कि girlfriend hai, teri bhabhi hai, and all of these things become part of entrenched in our culture and define us as men. So how do we move from there?
Mhm. Thank you. And I think that's a really important thing that you have brought up. I think this whole space for vulnerability is a conversation that we are typically not having when it comes to men. Right? I think in the public discourse also, vulnerability does not exist as something that men are able to state publicly, even though they might feel it. And masculinity is in hiding that sense of vulnerability that you might be feeling at different points of time, and in overcoming it very actively. And I also think that this whole discourse of toxic masculinity, again, what it does is it sort of ghettoizes all kinds. So I definitely don't want to go on to this not all men discussion, which I think is really like idiotic, and it is just meant to take over conversation which is on violence against women. But I feel that when we start bringing toxic masculinity into the mix, then a lot of times in actual non-academic discourse, men find it very hard कि now I have to be defensive, but I don't have to be too defensive. So a person who does not say identify with that kind of toxic masculinity finds it
Huh?
very hard then to engage.
There are men also who don't fit into that. For example, if you are a disabled person and you are sitting with 10 other men and all of them are boasting about women or girls, and your identity, your is taken for granted that you are not someone who is the player, you know. So how do how do disabled men fit in? They fit in sometimes by relying on those sexist misogynist tropes, but sometimes they feel isolated also. So it's it can work out either ways in terms of whether how our ideas of who we are is completely shaped by other people. For example, it's not shaped by us, our vulnerabilities or our qualities. It's generally shaped by how women treat us, or how women we behave with women, or how non-men behave, or how other people, society treats men. So it's always defined by other roles, and not, it's never about men. Masculinity is about, always there is a comparative thing going on. Is he, is a man enough for to be considered a man, and there is always this thing going on. So which also influences our idea of love, sex, everything. We don't talk about sex, and this was something which definitely we can bring up, because when we talk about sex, we basically talk about love. We like completely, uh, most of the disabled men I talk to talk about so much about unrequited love, but basically they can't go out and tell, they cannot be frank enough to tell me that they wanted to get laid and they couldn't, because they thought they were disabled and that's why they couldn't get laid. But that's a thing they won't be able to tell, because our conversations on sex and sexuality is so limited, that even men, disabled men especially, I think, find it hard to even understand their bodies if they don't have those sexual experiences. And that's a problematic thing, especially with them being vulnerable to also sexual aggression or abuse. So it's a very important issue that we often, and which disabled men definitely bring into the center, which we miss on conversations about sexuality and masculinity.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think exactly like you're saying, like a lot of times either this sexuality conversation goes into many other things, becomes academic, becomes about identity, and what ends up happening is that a lot of stuff which is just about sex, about just thinking about what sex really means, how that defines masculinity, and it was nicely thought out, I think, in one of the films that we saw, where they centered on this conversation on how much sex is an ideal man supposed to have. Is he supposed to, hold his seed as in the tradition of, traditional kushti and wrestling and all of that, and just like show restraint? Or is he supposed to be spreading his seed constantly, out having more and more and more dates and women? And what will ultimately help this man prove his masculinity? And I think this is also the pressure, like, and when I see connections between, say, different communities that don't fit into this idea of, how we understand masculinity in popular culture, then the queer community is either over sexualized, and the disabled community, disabled persons community, is completely asexualized, and not even acknowledge sexual desire that might be there, might need discussion, might need some active work. So I think that's and you actually bring this out very nicely together. You think about disability and sexuality in the realm of queerness. So I request you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will come to that, but we have, before I come to that, I will just say one thing, which is that we have to also think about, we always think about sex in terms of an act or an orientation or things like that, sexuality in terms of an orientation. We are not thinking about sex in terms of desire. So I have met disabled people who can't even self pleasure, who can't even masturbate. What happens to their sexual citizenship? What happens to their desires? And from there, because for me also, a lot of things about where uh, disability and queerness and masculinity merge is the idea of desire. Everyone wants to wants to have desires and be desired, be wanted. And it comes from a very, in fact, so I was going through a phase where I was questioning my own identity as a straight man, because I was going on these dates and facing this constant question over my masculinity, not only because I was disabled, but also because I had none of those masculine traits that people were searching for. So I was, in a way, I was, people were always questioning, are you bisexual, are you queer? And this was a question which came up, started coming up frequently, and I was wondering why would people ask me? Is it because I'm polite to them? Is it because I am non-aggressive? And do these things really uh, don't fit into masculinity? And so that made me think a lot. And I will actually, which we discussed earlier, I wrote a poem back in the day which was about this. uh, it's called I'm Not Man Enough for You. I'm not man enough for you, not man enough to stand without holding on, tall enough or strong, not man enough to camouflage my fears under the blanket of ego, not man enough to be complimented by your friends or fit into the picture perfect weddings that you have planned all along. I am man enough to love you deeply and yet queer enough to not be your man. The queerness of my disabled body makes me complete. It makes me human. It makes me unique. It makes me love who I am. And truth be told, I would rather be myself than be just your man. And it was also a period where I was thinking of how queerness is not only about sexual orientation, it's also about my body is different. I wear a diaper. So I one of the first conversations that I have with people I'm dating is that I wear a diaper and I have UTI, so urinary tract infection. Uh, so how does that shape my identity as a sexual person? And does it make me a man enough man, or do I diverge from that idea of a man because I am vulnerable and I'm accepting that vulnerability? So yeah.
Thank you for being like really, I mean, for that beautiful poem, first of all, like people are saying in the comments as well, and for putting it out so honestly, actually. That I think there isn't this kind of honest conversation about sex. And that is part of the problem, part of the taboo, where we are continuously wondering how much sex is appropriate or not. And I think the way you said it, even in this, I think one of the important things to recognize around masculinity and around different intersections of it is that actually the sexual in many spaces in many ways uh, gives us a vantage point to look at experiences that escape academia, that escape any kind of theorizing, where there is a great leveling that happens when people are able to talk more openly about what is desire, like you said, about what they desire, how they desire. And I think, like we were discussing earlier, even in the realm of desire, in some ways, queerness, disability, all of it gets fetishized in some realms, and in other ways, because you find now, maybe even in porn or in other spaces, like a huge diversity of people who all desire different kinds of things. So everybody is able to find their space somewhere. And I find that becomes sometimes much more liberating than academic spaces and discussions.
Yeah, I think one of the things which happens, which often I talk to disabled men whenever I'm talking to them, is that why don't you explore uh, more bodies within the disabled community? Why don't you date more disabled women? And some of it is to do with our spaces and how they're inaccessible, so people can't meet other disabled people. There are very few communities which are there, which actually facilitate that. But it's also about yeah, it's also about knowing your body, what it wants. It might not be, the idea of heteronormative sex is so deeply entrenched into our societal framework that when we talk about sex, we think about a woman on lying there and a man on top and having, missionary position sex. And that's almost, it becomes almost our idea of that, with most men who are not exposed to ideas, different ideas, we might have been exposed to different literature, different pop culture. But for most men, that is what sex is. And that's the thing which has to change, the idea of there is a heteronormative idea of sex which has to change, sexuality which has to change. And that will definitely make men also more comfortable with the idea of disabled men also more comfortable with the idea of their own bodies, because it's a right now the entire conversation on sex and sexuality, sex basically. Their sex life is driven by marriage, and their marriages are driven by mainly by patriarchy, which matches them according to disability or whatever uh, class, caste, whatever parameters they decide to. So for them to find actually comfort within in their who they are, their own bodies. And I think in that sense, disability has a lot to borrow from queerness. People are often afraid about that because queerness becomes like am I being gay? Or like the whole idea of queerness is very misunderstood within the heteronormative framework. But a lot of the comfort about who you are as a embodied person, your body, can straight people can also learn a lot from queer people. And indeed, I think in that sense, because the idea of sex itself changes within queer circles, and it's a much more sex friendly space. It might seem to have its problems, but it's a much more uh, sex friendly space, which is something which also comes from enjoying who you are, what your body is. And disabled people are shamed so much about their bodies that when they grow, when they become young, it's very different to make peace with their own idea of bodies. So sex and sexuality is the next step. The first thing is they have to be, comfortable with the idea of what their bodies are, and they are desirable too.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think, and this is a very, I think I completely resonate with what you're saying around the body then becoming this site of intersection between these different identities, which are all kind of around this central idea of, what is proper masculinity. And even within the queer community, for example, if you don't perform heteronormativity in a certain way, if you don't perform your masculine or your feminine self, then you are ignored. You become, vulnerable to discrimination. That you are asexualized just because nobody will have you. Because your body doesn't fit into a certain idea of what bodies that are sexual should be, and then it is in the body that we must find ways of bringing joy, comfort, of really sort of loving our own bodies first, in our journey to be able to have relationships or sex. Right, I think that is really a very, very good point of intersection between these two. And so that brings me also to this a conversation where many times we have thought about, okay, what is the intersection between disability and queer rights as experiences, disability and queerness as experiences, and disability rights and queer rights as movements. Where do they, how do they really meet? And even in this metaphor of saying disability is makes you certainly in a certain way queer. Sometimes it's you have to think a lot, saying, oh God, somebody will get offended if I say it like that, if they don't really understand where I'm coming from. So what are your thoughts on this, like as movements, as experiences? Where do they meet? How do they meet?
So I think one of the things which happens is, yeah, I was saying, yeah. So it's a very, when your body becomes the identifier for your movement, it becomes very difficult to people, for people to get together and talk about their experiences. Although we have common experiences across disabilities, we seldom have the forum to talk about our common experiences of isolation or vulnerabilities, because the entire movement as such has been focused more on rights. We are still at the very preliminary level. The RPD Act was passed in 2016, and hence uh, it is a very young act, and we are yet to actually explore the full. And more than the law itself, I think in terms of ground also there is less conversation. When you compare it to the queer movement, there is definitely much more conversation going on. Although even within the queer movement, there are questions about the nature of class, caste, and how that functions. And those questions will remain in a society which is hierarchical as an Indian society. Within all movements, those questions will remain relevant. But I think there's just more space to come together, and we are still building that space. And I think, for example, this is also a medium where we can come together, where different disabilities can come together and talk about similar experiences. I think vulnerabilities and isolation, I talk to a lot of friends who are hearing impaired and or blind, and I come from I have different bodily experiences than them, but our experiences of isolation, our vulnerabilities, our fears are sometimes very similar. And and it's across men, women. A lot of women wrote to me after I wrote about my experiences of having UTI and wearing diapers, because uh, they had their own nightmare stories of UTI or menstruation, or even spaces where they found dirty toilets. Someone found a dirty toilet and she was blind. And what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to check? These are the questions which we completely leave out of discussions on accessibility, on gender, on sexual harassment. How does a disabled woman go through a metro without being, and on her own as an independent person, without being sexually assaulted? So I think generally these are the questions we are still not able to bring together as such as a community and raise it as a community. But that will happen as we go along this journey. I think it will happen. Maybe forum or whoever uses this forum to bring along voices, it will also, these conversations will spark more ideas. The young generation will have more ideas about this. They will talk much more about. They will have their own, narratives about it, uh, which will be very fruitful for generations to come. And I personally, I keep learning from Koi moments. Anyways, I meet people who are constantly supporting each other, even if it's, I don't know, even if it's through social media, even if it's, but then I also realize that most people, disabled people, can't access Facebook. They can't because it's inaccessible. Most disabled people don't have interpreters. We don't have interpreters, so we can't watch a video together and discuss it. You know, uh, and so these are things where there's a long way to go, of course, and of course the learning keeps happening, and I think in that sense it's a very good way to grow by learning through each other's experiences.
I think, do we want to pause at this point and
Yeah.
maybe open up for questions from people who are watching or questions from Facebook if there's an audience putting questions there?
Correct. So we'll come to the audience questions in a bit. The team is sort of just collating those for us and sending it to us. Something very interesting. How does so? Thank you both. I think it's just. I think the conversation can go on. There's so much to pack. Sometimes it feels so simple, and sometimes it feels very complicated, right? What do queer masculinities look like? What do disabled masculinities look like? Or what just masculinity looks like for men, period, right? But this question of, and I'm very tempted to do like a rapid fire with both of you, which I will not, I'll resist myself. But really, a couple of questions that stood out for me from the video as well. This whole idea of consent, of na mein haan hoti hai, right? And it was defined in the video as um, a piece that men assumed, right? Something that men generally tend to assume, saying ladki ki naam hai, haan hoti hai. When a woman says no, it's still yes, or it's okay to sort of chase, etc. But isn't that so? In one of our consent workshops at Rising Flame, we run series of workshops on consent. And I remember conducting this in Delhi, and one of the participant was blind, a young blind man, and he said, "You know what? My problem is that it's assumed that I would always give consent. As a man, I am forced to give consent, saying that tu to mard hai, like you're a man. Come on, why would you say no to sex?" Just wanted to ask, just if y'all could share your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think a lot of these questions come from lack of understanding about, as I said, lack of understanding about body, sex, sexuality. Unless that happens, I don't think we'll understand consent altogether. We will understand, if we don't understand desire, how will we understand consent? A man, as you said, that example you gave, it's a very valid example. For example, if consent plays both ways, and I think uh, we we don't talk about it because the entire patriarchal structure has been so, it's so heavy in terms of where the power lies with men, that consent, that's why consent, the question of consent comes only with, you know it's more focused on women and consent. But it's the same with men, it's the same with non-men, it's the same with trans men, it's the same with anyone who actually has interacts with different bodies, and not only sex but also, what about consent? For example, for a disabled person it's also important, because what if someone tries to lead you somewhere, what if someone tries to, pull your wheelchair, or take your hand and pull you, which happens often, because people are not aware uh, at all etiquettes about how to treat disabled bodies. So consent starts from there also, and then it goes to the sexual realm also. But I think the more we talk about our bodies, and how that its sanctity and its, you know, uh, its importance, that it speaks for itself also in many ways. I think that will also lead to conversation on consent.
Right. Manak, would you like to add to this?
No, I completely agree with, I mean, how you raised the issue, Nidhi, as well as what Abhishek said, that there is this assumption. Like, I remember that from one of the workshops that we were doing, there was a young man. And I think it seems this whole bhabhi thing is a big porn trope, actually, because it seems like a lot of young men are able to have this sex conversation only with their bhabhi. And he shared about how there was a certain bhabhi in his colony who was around there who would continuously make hints and say something or the other. And he felt very scared actually about it. He also wanted to ask, but then didn't wanted to get into a space where he could not, then control what is happening, or he could not say, no, I don't want to be in this situation. And I think uh, for men who don't fit into this whole I will take control, I will become the person who's violating consent, this space to talk about my consent being violated is very small. And I think while I think queerness, queer identities, disability will actually be the liberating space where this conversation can be done by men, and hopefully then the regular heterosexual male sexuality space will learn from there. And men will become better, women will become better, every person across genders will become better at just navigating sex in that way.
Right. Right. No, no. And I love the use of like, we could teach the regular men. I think that's such an interesting um, way to put it, right? The whole idea that quote unquote normal or non disabled, heterosexual, or straight in common words, straight and normal people would define what a man looks like, right? And we were exploring this image of a Greek god, and we were thinking how many layers of issues are there within that, because we're trying to say that a man who does not have this kind of muscles doesn't is not a man enough. We're trying to say, who doesn't have this kind of beauty or whatever the way beauty is defined is not a man enough. And I think our media has a huge role to play in this whole. If you're not aggressive this much, it's not a man. You're not a man enough. And I really wanted to also ask a question about, and this is for both groups, right? For queer men, for disabled men, this pressure of you have to be the suraksha kavach, right? So you have to be the protector, provider, giver, um, and that kind of a, I don't know, a framing. Really, what are the, in your own spaces, coming from a personal lens rather than what you've seen in workshops? How does one even get out of, because there are many men on this call who may be facing similar questions through your personal journeys, or the journey of someone's personal journey. If you could explain, how do you even negotiate this kind of pressure that, oh, I'm not a man enough because I can't provide, or I'm not a man enough because I'm not able to protect my woman or my partner, right? So I just wanted to throw this open to bring this sort of conversation up a little bit of vulnerability here.
I think in my experience, and I'll speak more about like queer identities, friends who I've interacted with in my own life. I think actually a big disjunct that I felt myself while growing up was not really wanting to or being able to fit into this whole protector trope, right? Because I was also, I mean, the younger child in the house, not the coolest kid in school. So I really, like, in very concrete terms, could not be a protector. I'd probably be the person who'd get picked on. But I think accepting, understanding my queerness gave me two very interesting things and positions about this. One was the ability to reject it, to say ki bhai, I am to not like this kind of a man, so I don't need to really feel so sad about not fitting into that image because it's not even meant for me. So that allowed me an escape. At the other side, actually accepting, understanding my own queerness also gave me a sense of strength and being able to stand against any kind of bullying that I saw for myself and for other people from that vantage point of saying, okay, I have this connection with another person, of having experienced that vulnerability. So all the more reason where, and I will, of course, it's not just queerness, right? Like a whole bunch of caste, class, language, privilege plays into why I'm able to, in some ways or in some spaces, fit into this protector trope. And I think for me, it has continuously then been a process of where will I use it? What will I use this privilege for? And how much and how exactly must I continue to acknowledge it to give up that kind of space? So I think absolutely to what you were saying, this protective, like I've played around in my own life with this whole protective identity in many different ways, from being very young to now.
Yeah, I think with disabled men, the idea gets very subverted at a young age because the whole idea of protection becomes very important because their parents are very protective generally, or their family members are very protective. So the entire idea of protection, of course, and of course, the patriarchal society is there, and there will be influence of trying to protect, despite being disabled, protect your partner or whoever. But I think the more important question for them becomes independence, because independence means not depending on your parents, not uh, that you can live on your own, that you can afford a carer, that you can marry and sustain a household. And these questions are still, they seem very like, routine, but these questions are very important when you are disabled, because otherwise you are completely, if you're dependent on five other people, maybe they are your family members, maybe they are other people, you definitely would want to assert yourself in some way, because you are anyways in the societal hierarchy of things, you can become powerless. And I think a lot of disabled men use independence to really assert themselves, that they can actually live on themselves, they can afford to have a family. And of course, it depends on your privileges. Again, caste, class also plays into it.
Correct.
But I think independence is a big issue and something we definitely need to talk more about, because then there comes interdependence and different things, and how we are all interdependent on each other. But I
Right.
think, yeah, but I think independence is an issue that we need to explore more.
Right. I think I was just going to say that, Abhishek, when you were talking, I was like, independence is overrated, right? And this pressure of independence is on disabled people because they're like, oh, prove yourself.
Yeah,
But everybody else will live interdependently. And they're like, of course, societies and communities live interdependently. But then you turn around and tell a disabled person, but you're not independent. And you just wonder, saying, what happened to the question of interdependence, right? As if nothing else matters. And this is, I think, we deviate, but this is a whole exercise on proving how quote unquote normal functioning can you be, or how can you live up to quote unquote gender roles defined by normal society. And every time I use the word normal, I just want to be in quotes. So I'm just giving that disclaimer here. And I think Manak, from what you said, it's so interesting because this idea of, if you're the youngest child, then you're not the protector, but if you're elder, so it's not just, there's so many defined roles for so many positions that you hold in a community, in a family, in society. It's so interesting. And that took me back when you were saying, um, it took me back to from my childhood, right? The whole idea is like, Are Baba, you're a girl, why do you have such a loud voice? And it's the same if you're a man and if you want to be looked at as a man, and if you don't have a loud voice, right? So it's not just how you look, it's what you behave. And if you don't have the loud voice, that can shut everyone up. And if as a woman you have a loud voice, that could probably is not meant to shut everyone up, but just you're expressive and loud. It's just that it doesn't work either way, right? You're unseated from this whole idea of feminine enough and masculine enough. So that's very interesting that you brought in. Abhishek, you said something about asserting. And that also brings me to a question. Before that, I'd like to invite everyone to type their questions. For those of you who are watching us live on Facebook, please feel free to leave your questions in the comments, and we'll ensure that they're answered here. For all of you who are on the Zoom call, we'd really appreciate if you left a question in the chat box. If you're not able to type the long question, you can just say I, type the word I or question in the chat box and we'll unmute you. Or just click on the raise your hand icon. Whatever is convenient, please feel free to use that. And just if you need any other accommodation, write to some of us. So one question for both of you here is, when it comes to assertion, and to really play the masculine roles that are expected by society. I mean, both of you were able to negotiate, reflect on, support other men with or without disabilities, at different axes of intersection, to really understand themselves, to unpack some of these complexities. But there are many, many, many men, and particularly I'd refer to disabled men here, having worked with a lot of disabled youth. The pressure is to imitate this concept of masculinity. And because it may be against your nature, the assertion quickly moves into aggression. So Manak and Abhishek, asking both of you, and this is something that we see probably in other identities. Maybe Manak, you want to talk about trans-masculine identities a little bit. Maybe Abhishek, if you could elaborate a little more on what this looks like, particularly in the community, in your experience, in your interactions with other disabled men, etc., on how somehow internalizing this normative masculinity or internalizing this real man idea ends up into assertion or aggression, as not just an additional effort but a practice behavior.
Yeah, I think what you said was completely right. We often talk about how uh, men are also victims of patriarchy in some ways. And I think when we talk about hegemonic masculinity, it's a reflection of, excuse me. Mani, can you continue? I will just pause.
Sure. Yeah, I can take it up from before Abhishek. I think two things that came to my mind when you were saying this. One was, like you said, as within the LGBTQ community, and I will break down this queer clearly, is there is a lot of pressure to conform to certain normal behaviors, quote unquote, of gender. So if you're gay and you're very effeminate, then that becomes a problem. If you're trans and not effeminate enough as a trans woman, then that becomes a problem. If you're a trans masculine person and if you're then not masculine enough, then that becomes a problem. So I think this whole box of gender norms and gender normative behavior doesn't go away with different identities, unfortunately. And we often find that for trans, I mean, I've heard this from friends who also have other friends who are trans masculine, who work with trans masculine persons, that there is this kind of inherent pressure in friends groups and communities to then demonstrate your masculinity once you have did, or you have made a transition or something, whatever. Like once if you want to assert that you are trans masculine, then masculine is the more operative part of it, and that is what you must continuously and sometimes aggressively bring to the fore. And I think exactly like you're saying, I think this line is very, very thin for all men, like where assertion as an being able to assert yourself and being man enough goes into aggression. That's a very thin line, and we absolutely don't have enough conversation or teach boys to be able to tread that line very, very carefully. And I think that's where a lot of this problem of toxic masculinity, quote unquote, or just masculine aggression, this whole training of boys into being men is a training into violence, because you always have to be men violently by protecting, your women, your property, your country, or something or the other. And it is a large kind of patriarchal enterprise. I think.
Yeah, see,
Yeah.
I think the same thing happens in communities, disabled community also. What happens is basically because there's so much of pressure, or maybe that is such entrenched. The idea of masculinity is so entrenched within them that what happens is when uh, within their own circles, and I've heard it through a lot of disabled friends, of the culture of misogyny, or the culture of even showing that मैं उसको पटा लूंगा, वो पट जाएगी, and all that keeps happening within disabled community also, which is not uncommon at all. And so I think the whole idea of patriarchy in that sense dominates the discourse, even within persons with disabilities, because it shapes, it's basically, they also want to, and I agree with Nidhi, assertion is a very tricky subject, because when they want to assert themselves within families, with their partners, it might turn into the actual oppression of the partner or people around them, because that's the only way space for them to show that they are powerful. And
Right.
that is actually that creates the entire problem.
Right. We'll just pause here. The team has let us know that Sayanthan has their hand raised. Could you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I am Shayantan Banerjee. I am a school teacher from West Bengal, Calcutta. So I have a doubt and I have a query. Being a disabled man, I'm a blind person, totally blind person. So something I have to know and I have to face this issue in my childhood and right now also when I working as a school teacher in 4 years. Now my parents are saying, uh, go to your marriage and you look someone. Then I have to find someone. Then her family asks, are you a blind person? Are you able to take care of herself? And being at this session is very good because we need a more awareness in our community. मैंने देखा हमारा जो कम्युनिटी है वहाँ पर भी हमने देखा कभी कभी क्या होता है पढ़ाई करने तक कोई कोई शादीशुदा हो जाता है, उसके बाद समझते नहीं है कब क्या करना चाहिए. मैं रूरल वेस्ट बंगाल में भी काम करता हूँ जहाँ पर डिसेबल लोगों का पता ही नहीं है हाउ टू हैंडल देयर सेल्फ. Being a man, being a woman, both are them. And some of also LGBTQ community in our Calcutta are facing some difficulty. My question is, it's 2020. We should take a change and we should take a pledge to create awareness. And thank you, Nidhi, organizing such a wonderful session for us.
Thank you so much, Sayanthan.
I ask this question, both of you, anyone can please answer.
Yeah.
हाँ, आई थिंक मुझे लगता है कि आप लोग, वो बहुत ही कॉमन चीज है. बहुत लोगों के साथ ऐसा है कि जब वो स्पेशली जब वो शादी या ऐसी चीजों में घुसना चाहते हैं तो एक ऑलमोस्ट कंपैरिजन होता है कि अच्छा ब्लाइंड लोगों में भी कौन ज्यादा ब्लाइंड है और उससे वो कौन सा ज्यादा रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कौन किसके पास है, इंडिपेंडेंस के बावजूद भी कौन घर का काम कर सकता है, कौन बिना किसी केयरर के क्या साइटेड पर्सन बेटर पार्टनर है, ऐसे सब सवाल वैसे ही करके बाकी जगह भी वो सारे क्वेश्चंस आते ही रहते हैं. तो आई थिंक
I want to add one more thing.
please.
The thing is that I have to sacrifice their qualification also. Suppose I am postgraduate. The women come to his HS pass. Why I sacrifice my qualification during my disability? Why? हमको sacrifice भी करना पड़ता है ये qualification में. देखो तुम तो blind हो, तुम्हारे लिए ये लड़की अच्छा है, तुमसे शादी करना चाहते हैं, यही तुम्हारे लिए God blessing, but not.
बिल्कुल सर. हाँ, ये तो होता ही है सर, क्योंकि होता ही है कि हम लोग क्लास वास सब कुछ को एक खिचड़ी बनाते हैं और देखते हैं कि कौन केयरिंग रोल, एक बहुत बड़ा, एक आपने जो शब्द उठाया उससे बहुत बड़ा एक सवाल उठता है कि केयरिंग का कितना बड़ा रोल है एक रिलेशनशिप में, खास करके एक मैरिटल रिलेशनशिप में. और हम जब डिसेबल कम्युनिटी में शादियों की बात होती है तो अधिकतर बिकॉज women are considered to be the carers, उन पे वो होता है, तो शादियां ये देख के ही होती हैं कि कौन ज्यादा अच्छा केयर कर सकेगा, मतलब कौन सी औरत केयर कर सकेगी,
केयरिंग तो
और उस
बात
सिस्टम।
एक होगा, केयरिंग का बात तो है,
हाँ
लेकिन
Shanta
और
ji,
एक बात।
sorry, I just wanted to add uske pehle wale question mein, and then you can add more. I just want to say that jo Abhishek is trying to tell you is that the society tries to cancel out negativities, right? So disability, according to societal understanding, is a defect. Being from a quote unquote lower class is a defect. Being from a lower caste, again in quotes, is a defect. So how do you match two defects is what they look at. So being less educated is a defect. Having less formal education. So these are all societal understandings of defect. And when people behave like this, it's the whole idea is that you match a defect to a defect rather than a person to a person. I hope that helps in responding to your question. Can we hold the other question from you, because we have one more question, or if you can be brief, then we need to move to Ketan. He has his hand raised as well.
Okay, okay, okay. No problem.
Could we move to Ketan, please?
Hi, both of you. Actually, I have a question. I meant being very brief because I know others are there. Is that not only the community that views the way it does? The example that Shantanu gave. Even blind people are looking for caregivers than wives. Unfortunately, they don't want to marry blind wives because nahi nahi, वो आएगी तो मेरा सब हो जाएगा comfortably. Anyway, that's another issue. But my question was slightly different, and that is that masculinity is a concept that's, as we all been speaking, is a centuries old concept. Patriarchy being what it is. My question is, or rather, submission is that why are we not looking at this from the point of view of a woman with disability? Because here, masculinity does not necessarily, as we all know, mean only in terms of on bed. It also means on many things. And I've seen women themselves who also want their men to be, oh no, but you are the stronger one. I mean, it's such a small thing like when disciplining the children. पापा को आने दो तब मैं उनको बताऊंगी. Why the hell can't you be doing what you are supposed to do? Why do you need papa to do all that? I mean, and this is not only in disability, this is everywhere. And in disability, the problem is even more difficult because the man thinks that because he's disabled, he's got to prove himself doubly, and hence he will also try to overpower the woman who is disabled. And woman would also, since she can't do many of the things, she would succumb. I have known many premarital sex relationships where women have been helped by men, and since women have nothing else to return, they have indulged in this without realizing the consequences, and then they fall into consequences and had undesirable results. So it's a very complex thing, and I don't know how you guys view this quid pro quo kind of a situation. When I'm giving something which I shouldn't be giving for the favors that a so-called man, quote unquote, does on for me.
Ethan, you've put out such, it will need another session to unpack, but we'll start with our speakers and thank you for your question. And it is complicated. We'll come to Manak and Abhishek will be able to unpack what you're saying and would have a lot to share with you. So can I go to both of you, maybe Manak to you and to Abhishek next?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think, I just want to acknowledge that this, you're absolutely right. Like everybody becomes a vehicle for patriarchy, right? No matter what your gender. So all of these gender norms that we learn from all around us, we all reproduce in our close relationships. I have done it. I have got it from other people, and it's continuously there. I think, and because we were talking about sex and sexuality and relationships, it infiltrates, it permeates into relationships and how people set expectations in relationships, and into sex as well, and how people imagine sexual interactions or think or feel pressured about sexual interactions as well. And I think what I find most interesting and most common actually is that the disjunct between the idea that this is masculinity and my own performance of masculinity and my own experience of it and the experience of everybody who's a real person around me is very, very different. But still, the media, the messaging, the neighbors, the family members, despite me being a different kind of man, sometimes I continue to reproduce a certain image of masculinity only learned from outside. And I think that's part of the problem, that and also acknowledging that sometimes that also shapes desire. It's very difficult to take it apart. My desire for a certain kind of man, physically, or what they will do, what they will be like, is also shaped by what I'm continuously hearing about masculinity. And it's a process to actually unpack and let go of a lot of that. That's what I feel.
Abhishek, would you like to add something?
Masculinity is a very performative thing anyways. We are constantly performing a gender role. And so whether this the whole thing which you talked about is, of course, it's a lot about performance, it's a lot about, but then it's also entrenched in the structures of power. So why do women also seek that? Because women have been trained, they are also influenced as much by patriarchy as men, and it shapes them too. So they also think that there is a certain way in which a man should behave. But the point again is ki with disabled men it works anyways very differently. I'm sure you also must have seen ki, there is, if there's always the doubt on someone's masculinity is often posed by, not by women but primarily by men around them. When they go to male groups, all male groups, when they go to their own friend circles, the whole idea of performance is often tested there, and not within the household. Of course, within the household there are duties which uh, are expected, each partner is expected to perform, and they might be segregated on gendered lines, because of course it's a marriage is an institution which is very gendered and very patriarchal in some sense. So uh, I think I think that's about it. There's nothing more to add to that. But yeah, it's a complex issue, as Nidhi said, and we can talk about the other example you gave. We can talk about it like it's a never-ending issue with men with disabilities, and so yeah.
So just taking the liberty of being the facilitator here and taking a couple of lines, Ketan, it's everything absolutely what Manak and Abhishek are saying, but it's in two words, it's internalized roles, right? So as a disabled woman, when someone like me speaks up and says, shut up, like I'll give consent or not, or I'll, if I had kids, I'll decide. I don't see someone like me saying, Papa ko jaake pucho, right? But that will be so frowned upon by society. So it's not like everyone can delineate between their own voice and societal voices, or patriarchal voices, or stigma or defined roles. So it's really coming from there. And the second piece I definitely want to address, I think it's a very, very complex issue. Um, it is an issue within the community, and you particularly gave an example of a disabled man and a disabled woman, and that's why I'm saying within the community. There are many instances where it is a multi-layered response to it. So first is the lack of exposure to sexuality education. I think let's begin from there. So when you say people don't know the consequences, where does that come from? That comes from lack of information, accessible information or access to information. And I think starting from there, mixing it with gender roles, and then mixing it with the sexual identity. So continuously being treated as asexual, undesirable, so on and so forth. Women with disabilities, it's a huge piece. When they're violated also in cases of sexual violence, also they're told, be thankful that somebody slept with you, because otherwise, like, who was anyway going to find you attractive, right? So I think there are multiple layers to when you say a woman with disability, or you've seen cases where they've given in or succumbed, and also the exposure to really worldly manipulations, right? So if somebody promises saying, oh, and this whole promise of sex, the confusion between sex and marriage is so great. It was also in one of the workshops where we conducted many years ago when I was heading the Sexuality and Disability Project at Point program at Point of View. We conducted this session where the woman with a disability said that, but I was promised, only on the promise of marriage did I agree to sleep with him. And what are there legal recourses? Are there social recourses? How can you protect yourself against breach of promise in this case? What are the real protections that you have, right? So I think some of these conversations and knowledge and information are really missing. And it's a far more complex thing to unpack. I'm just going to reach out to Shruti here to ask. I don't notice any more questions, and the team has been sharing questions. So are there anything else that folks want to ask, or we'll go for last comments to both our speakers?
Yeah, there are no more questions.
Thank you so much, Rick.
My question is that it's about consent. So the disabled man or woman should be, their consent is priority, because I add something to it. Due to on my experience, it's neat about consent, and Kedan sir said very well. Before marry, or are we married, why we are living not? हमने लिविंग भी तो कर सकते, वहां पर भी फैमिली को एक प्रोग्रेसिव नहीं है, हर जगह पे हम लोगों को प्रूफ करना पड़ता है. Why? Being a feminist, being a feminism student, I am a student of international relations. I learned feminist. The feminist says we do anything, but our society does not. Thank you for awareness campaign is that going on. So that's
Thank
it.
you.
That I add my point.
Thank you. As a feminist, I want to assure that we don't just do anything. That's really a misconception, but going over to you, Abhishek.
No, sir. When we have more feminist men like you who think like you, we will change the community also. So it completely depends on that. Right now, we are not in a situation to change because people don't think like that. It will slowly come. We are a very young community. We are still getting the fruits of reservation, of jobs, of trying to live on our own. So it's a slow, gradual process, and I think we will move towards that. And those issues are important. And with people like you, I'm sure those issues will be raised again, of living independently, of live in relationships, and how that can work. We also have a very bad welfare system, sir. So that's one of the biggest problems. If we had a stronger welfare system where carers were provided, where helpers were provided, where the government would say, okay, we'll give you certain protection. Imagine disabled people living on their own in an apartment and being harassed by their neighbors, which has happened. I have friends that has happened to friends of mine. So imagine that happening, and so without any kind of social protection, without any kind of support from people around you, it is still a faraway dream, and we'll work towards that. Of course, people like you and me and everyone will work towards that, but it's still, there is a lot to build upon. So we would ideally want that thing, but that thing is not really practical right now, and it's not. Let's not just say let's not be harsh on people and say it's just because of patriarchy. It's also because they have this fear. They are also, and that is a justifiable fear. To be disabled in this society, to live on your own, is such a difficult task sometimes, especially if you are a woman. As you said, the feminist perspective, if you are a woman, it's even more difficult to live on your own, to be independent, to just move around as a disabled person. Yes. So yeah, all of these complications do exist, and we need to, of course, work on that.
Thank you, Abhishek. Manak, coming to you quickly for a part of this question, actually, about how do you respond to young people when they ask you about this whole question of why are families stopping us? We'd like to do a live-in. What is this? I mean, we can deconstruct marriage and talk about things and say why people also prefer. There are many people who actively prefer to get married, etc. But we're not going into that. But really, this choice of, is there a choice really where as far as how do you live with your partner is concerned?
So I think class is the biggest factor that enables or disables, like, enables or does not allow you choice in this matter. Are you able to live together? Do you have a space of your own? A lot of what Abhishek was saying. Like, we don't have a system that will, allow you to have systems for, quote unquote, independence of that kind, like that, and of course, with all the caveats around independence that you were talking about. And I think there are two parts to it. One is that we never have conversation, even to the consent part of that question. We never, with young people or children, have any conversation about sex. So therefore, young people, when they are having sex with each other, they don't have conversation about sex. It's just about a lot of times the assumption that with this whole trope of masculinity, the man is supposed to know, and the woman will just find out when it's happening, what it is, and she's not supposed to know. These are the assumptions that we work under, and that's what it becomes for a lot of young people. And so this room for conversation, this room for rejection, and conversation on rejection. So, has she said no to me? Has she said no to doing this? Can we do something else? Or has she said no to doing anything with me? Has she said no to relationship? That kind of thinking, that kind of conversation is not allowed. And I think what is interesting in this moment of time is that while there is a lot more conversation about alternative ways of living and being in relationships, even in public mainstream media, large surveys on young people's choices and desires still point to people want arranged marriage, that young people talk primarily to their mothers or their parents about sex. So that's where I'm also trying to figure out, how to navigate this resurgence, in a sense, of conservatism, or at least this wanting to, in public conversation, be a little conservative to even protect yourself or to go with the mainstream, while continuously also being bombarded in the media with very, very different kinds of sexual, and not even just sexual I don't mean a bad thing when I say sexual, but like a whole range of diversity of choice around living your life. These two things are right now working together in our society, and I feel that now with my answer to changing this narrative has always been that we need to start, like, the space for intervention is the family group on WhatsApp. That is where take our politics and
Yes.
start talking differently, and that's where change can then happen.
Great. That's a brilliant, brilliant piece of idea, Manak, because I know some people have started and they're like, well, why are you speaking like this? You're being trained by someone else and things like that. But to go gentle, but be persistent in the family group, start having those conversations is really, really important. Thank you so much, both of you. We've shot over time. I just was checking that in the 3 minutes that I got dropped, did Abhishek read his poem on masculinity?
Yes, Nidhi. Yes, I did.
So, thank you for bringing that those thoughts and really, really making the session also so woven with both your personal narratives, with your experience, making it so rich in its just diverse ways of thinking and challenging what normal and normative looks like for masculinity, for really helping us unpack, okay, what's a real man? This big question of real man, of mard ko dard nahi hota, of aggression and assertion, of just allowing this space to be who you are. So thank you so much, both of you, and thank you everyone who joined us on the call. I'd like to thank our sign language interpreter Gaurav, our captioners, Rising Flame interns Niyar and Fiza, Anicca for managing the entire live stream, our program associate, Srinidhi, our co-leads program, for managing the whole call and working with us for just keeping an eye on the audience, that we don't leave anyone out. Divya for conceptualizing and helping us with the design, who's also an intern with Rising Flame. So thank you to the entire team, and thanks to our speakers once again, Abhishek and Manak. We hope we all are able to change the world one discussion at a time, one step at a time, and rethink masculinity, rethink gender roles, to make this a more inclusive, diverse, and accepting world. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you 2 weeks from now on Friday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. You could write to us to get added to our mailing list. We will anyway reach out to you with what our new Vellapanti session 2.0 would look like on 2nd October, Friday, 6 to 7:30 p.m. Stay tuned on our social media, on Twitter at Rising Flame Now, on Facebook page of Rising Flame, and our website, www.risingflame.org. Have a lovely evening and a super weekend ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. Please do like, share, and subscribe, and click the bell button for updates. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or visit our website to know more about our work. Links in the description.